They came to her door half frozen and broken. Men who looked human but carried scars and secrets from battles not fought on Earth. By sunrise, Clara Winslow's life was forever changed. The wind howled across the plains of northern Wyoming that night, strong enough to rattle the shutters on Clara Winslow's old farmhouse. At 74, Clara had seen plenty of winters, but the storm outside felt heavier, angrier, almost like the earth itself wanted to smother everything under its weight. She had just added another log to the stove and pulled her shawl tighter when it happened. 3 sharp knocks against her front door. Not the groaning creak of wood shifting in the wind, not a loose branch scratching against the siding. No, this was deliberate, heavy, urgent. Clara froze. Her nearest neighbor was miles down the road. The snow had been falling since noon, covering everything in thick, white layers. Who in their right mind would be out in this? She set her cup of tea down, the ceramic clinking softly against the saucer. For a moment, she told herself it must have been her imagination. But then the knocking came again, louder this time. She reached for the lamp and made her way to the door, her slippers scuffing across the old wooden floor. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady, though her heart gave her away with its fast, nervous beating. There was silence for a few seconds, the storm roaring in the background. Then a voice, strange, accented, like someone forcing English through a broken filter. "Please, help!" Clara hesitated, her hand resting on the latch. Something about the tone cut deep. It wasn't just a request. It was desperation. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out into the night. Her breath caught. 10 men stood in her yard, barely visible against the swirling snow. They wore heavy coats, though nothing she recognized. Dark, quilted gear with patches she couldn't make out in the poor light. Their faces were pale, exhausted, eyes hollow with fatigue. And yet there was something else in their expressions, something trained, disciplined. "Please," one of them said again, his words clumsy but clear enough. Cold. Shelter. Every instinct told her this didn't make sense. Soldiers? Out here? In the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, miles from any base? Her late husband, Walter, had served in the military, and she knew the look of men trained to follow orders. These strangers had that same air, but nothing else about them fit. Clara hesitated. She wasn't helpless. She kept Walter's old shotgun in the closet by the kitchen, but she also wasn't reckless. At her age, she had learned the value of listening to her gut, and her gut told her she couldn't turn away people on the edge of collapse. She drew a breath and opened the door. The wind rushed in, icy and wild, whipping her shawl around her shoulders. The men stepped closer, their boots crunching in the snow. The one who seemed to lead them, tall, lean, his face streaked with frost, lowered his head slightly. "Thank you," he said, the words stiff but sincere. Clara stepped aside. "Get in quick." Before we all freeze to death, they filed into her home one by one, stamping snow from their boots, their breath heavy clouds in the air. Clara shut the door behind them, locking the storm outside. The warmth of the stove spread across the room, and the men seemed to melt into it, their shoulders sagging as though a weight had lifted. Clara studied them quietly. Their coats were thick, yes, but not like anything she'd seen in stores. Their boots were caked with snow but carried strange markings etched into the leather, and beneath the coats she caught flashes of something metallic, plating, straps, gear that didn't belong to hunters or farmers. "Where are you boys coming from?" she asked, her tone calm, though her mind was buzzing with questions. The leader met her gaze. His English faltered, words broken and uneven. "Long walk. We fight. Need safe." Clara frowned. Fight? Against what? Out here in this endless stretch of snow and quiet fields, there was nothing but cattle and fences. Yet something in his voice, the weight, the exhaustion, made her push the questions aside. "All right," she said finally. "You'll get warm here, but I don't have much food." One of the younger men spoke, his accent heavier. "Food, not needed. Rest." Clara gave a small nod. Her eyes swept across their faces, each one worn with fatigue, shadows under their eyes. Whoever they were, whatever strange war they carried on their shoulders, they were human enough to be cold, tired, and hungry. And she couldn't ignore that. She moved to the kitchen. "I'll heat some stew." As the pot warmed, she glanced back into the living room. The men had settled around the stove, silent, their eyes fixed on the flames. They didn't speak to each other, not in English at least, but the way they sat, alert despite their exhaustion, made Clara's heart tighten. They weren't just travelers, they were soldiers, soldiers from somewhere she couldn't yet name. But Clara would soon realize the storm outside was only the beginning. The real weight of the night was still pressing at her door. The air inside Clara Winslow's farmhouse carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and stew. The storm still roared beyond the walls, but for the first time that night, warmth pushed back the cold. Clara ladled broth into mismatched bowls, her hands steady even as her mind reeled. 10 men, 10 strangers dressed like no soldiers she'd ever seen, and all of them crowding her small living room. She brought the first 2 bowls in, setting them on the table near the stove. "It's not much," she said, "but it'll keep you from freezing inside." The tall man, the one who had spoken at her door, glanced at the food. He hesitated before lowering himself to sit, his movements stiff. "Grateful," he said, the word clipped, like he was forcing it past a barrier in his throat. The others followed his lead. Some dipped their spoons quickly, others studied the stew with curiosity, sniffing it before tasting. Clara noticed the younger one she had spoken with earlier. His hands trembled as he lifted the bowl, but not from the cold, something deeper, something worn into his bones. She pulled a chair closer, sitting opposite the group. "I'll need to know who I've let into my home," she said firmly, her eyes sweeping across their faces. A silence hung heavy. The leader exchanged looks with the men before answering. "We, soldiers." "Soldiers from where?" Clara asked. Her late husband's old friends had told stories of deployments in far-off countries, but these men didn't speak like anyone from overseas. Their English was broken, but not in the usual way. Each word sounded like it was pieced together on the spot. The leader's jaw worked as he searched for the right words. Finally, he said, "Far." "No name." "You know," Clara narrowed her eyes. "You telling me you can't name your country?" One of the others leaned forward suddenly. His skin was pale, almost gray under the lamplight, his cheek marked with a jagged scar. "Different," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Not same as you." The room fell quiet again, the storm's howl filling the gap. Clara felt her stomach twist. They weren't lying, at least not completely. She had nursed enough men in pain to recognize the weight of truth when it cracked through a person's voice. "Well," she said, trying to keep her tone even, "different or not, you'll freeze to death if you're out in that blizzard. So for tonight, this house is yours." The younger man, he couldn't have been older than 20, set his bowl down and stared at her. His eyes were wide, almost too dark, and for the first time, Clara noticed something unusual in them. Not just exhaustion, but a depth she couldn't quite place. "You kind," he said softly. "We no deserve." Clara blinked. "Everyone deserves warmth when the world's frozen over," she said. It came out harsher than she intended, but her heart softened the moment she saw relief flicker across his face. She moved back toward the kitchen to fetch more food, her thoughts running wild. She had expected 1, maybe 2 lost travelers at her door. But 10? In uniforms she didn't recognize, speaking like strangers in their own tongues. It didn't add up. When she returned, they had shifted positions, settling closer to the stove. Their boots left wet patches across her rug, snow dripping onto the floorboards. She didn't care. What gripped her attention were the weapons. Not rifles, not sidearms, but strange tools, half hidden under their coats. She caught glimmers of metal that didn't match anything she'd seen during her years as a nurse at the local VA. Her eyes lingered too long. The leader noticed. "No fear," he said suddenly, his voice firmer. We not harm." Clara straightened. "If I thought you meant harm, I'd never have opened that door." She gestured toward the stove. "You all look half dead. My job is to keep you alive until morning." For the first time, the leader's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. It was faint, fleeting, but enough to soften the room's tension. The men began speaking quietly to one another in a language Clara couldn't follow. Harsh consonants, clipped rhythms. It rolled through the air like gravel over stone. She didn't interrupt. She only watched, memorizing every gesture, every shared glance. Her cat, an old gray tabby named Smudge, padded into the room and froze at the sight of the strangers. To Clara's surprise, the youngest soldier reached a hand out, palm open. Smudge approached cautiously, then pressed her head against his fingers. The man's face broke into something tender, almost childlike. It was then Clara's fear wavered. They weren't monsters. They weren't invaders tearing through her home. They were men, worn thin, pulled too far from wherever they belonged. Still, her nurse's instinct told her something was wrong. She could see it in their stiff movements, the way some clutched their sides, the strange discoloration creeping along one man's arm. Injuries, not all human. She stood brushing crumbs from her apron. "Eat what you can. Rest where you like. Tomorrow, when the storm's gone, we'll figure out what to do next." The leader gave a sharp nod, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Tomorrow," he echoed. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow carried more than just the end of a storm. It carried answers she wasn't sure she wanted to face. The storm clawed at the windows through the night, but inside Clara Winslow's farmhouse, the glow of the stove held steady. The soldiers had gathered close, their boots and coats dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, steam rising faintly as the warmth worked its way back into their bodies. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. The way they sat so still, eyes sharp even in exhaustion, like wolves who had learned never to let their guard down. She cleared her throat. "There are more quilts in the chest by the stairs," she said. "If you're staying, you may as well be comfortable." The youngest of them, the one who had coaxed her cat into purring at his side, tilted his head in thanks and rose quietly to fetch them. Clara followed with her eyes as he lifted the lid of the cedar chest, drawing out blankets she had sewn years ago with Walter. They were worn but thick, each one stitched with tiny imperfections she could recognize at a glance. To see them draped across the shoulders of strangers was strangely intimate, as though the past she had built in this house was suddenly shared with men she didn't know. She stepped closer to the stove and lowered herself into her chair. Smudge leapt into her lap, curling in the folds of her shawl, her tail flicking slowly as if still weighing the newcomers. Clara stroked her absent-mindedly, though her gaze never left the group. One of the men, broader than the rest, cradled his right arm against his chest. He tried to mask the wince each time he shifted, but Clara had spent decades reading pain on faces that pretended otherwise. "You there?" she said gently. "Let me look at that arm." The man stiffened. The leader spoke a quick phrase in their tongue, sharp and commanding. The injured man hesitated, then slowly extended his arm toward Clara. When the sleeve rolled back, her breath caught. A deep gash stretched across his forearm, but it wasn't just blood she saw. It was faint, luminous veins running from the wound outward, as if the injury carried a light of its own. The glow was faint, pulsing softly, yet enough to make her draw back for an instant. Clara forced her voice steady. "That needs cleaning. Infection doesn't care who you are or what you are." She left briefly and returned with a basin of hot water, clean rags, and a small bottle of iodine. The soldiers watched closely, their eyes following every move as though the simple act of care were a ritual foreign to them. She dabbed at the wound, the glow beneath his skin flickering like embers under ash. The man winced, but didn't pull away. "Strange," she murmured under her breath. The leader's gaze snapped to hers. "Not same," he said carefully. "No," Clara agreed softly, "but still flesh, still pain." She wrapped the wound tightly, tying the bandage with practiced hands. The soldier bowed his head slightly in thanks, though no words followed. One by one, Clara's eyes fell on each of them. Scratches, bruises, exhaustion buried in their posture. They looked less like a platoon of soldiers now, and more like a group of men driven too far past their limit. She leaned back in her chair. Whatever fight you came from, it left its marks. I won't ask questions tonight, but you should know, I'm no fool. You're not from here, not from anywhere close. The leader studied her, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but seemed to weigh the words too heavily, and in the end, he only said, "Truth, tomorrow." That word again, tomorrow. Clara folded her arms, choosing not to press further. The room settled into a strange calm. A few of the men dozed lightly. Others kept silent watch by the window, their eyes tracing the storm outside as if expecting enemies to appear out of the white. Clara noticed the way they shifted positions with quiet discipline, never fully relaxing, even with food in their bellies and quilts on their backs. She dozed off briefly in her chair, waking to the sound of hushed voices, two of the men speaking in their language near the stove. She caught none of the meaning, only the cadence, urgent, tense, broken by pauses that suggested disagreement. The leader cut them short with a single command, his voice carrying authority that silenced the air itself. Smudge stirred in Clara's lap, her ears twitching. Clara whispered to her, "They're running from something, Smudge. Something bigger than this storm." The cat blinked as if in agreement. The night dragged on. The storm outside finally began to thin, the howling wind giving way to the softer sound of snow still falling. Clara pulled another quilt around her shoulders and let her eyes rest again, though her thoughts refused to still. Strangers or not, she had opened her home, fed them, bandaged their wounds. Whatever they were hiding behind their accents and strange gear, they were still men, and for one night they were hers to keep alive. But as the first faint light of dawn crept across the horizon, Clara had no idea that the truth waiting outside would turn her act of kindness into something far greater and far stranger than she could ever have imagined. The faint blue glow of morning hadn't yet broken through the storm when Clara stirred from her chair. Her neck ached from sleeping upright, but her eyes snapped open at the sound of movement. Two of the men were still by the window, whispering in their sharp, gravelly language. Their silhouettes looked like shadows cut against the glass, tall and rigid. Clara rose slowly, Smudge hopping off her lap with a soft thud. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped closer. The boards creaked under her weight. The men turned immediately, their eyes catching the glow of the stove. They didn't reach for weapons, but the reaction was too sharp, too disciplined to ignore. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice calm. The leader, seated near the fire, lifted his head. He had been watching her even as he pretended to rest. "Storm," he said, then after a pause, "and questions." Clara crossed her arms. "You're not the only one with questions." The leader gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, ask." She lowered herself slowly, the chair groaning beneath her. Smudge leapt onto the armrest, her green eyes narrowed as if she, too, was weighing the strangers. Clara rested her hands in her lap and studied the man before her. His features were sharp, almost too symmetrical. His skin stretched tight as though carved rather than grown. He spoke English like it was borrowed, the words placed carefully, one by one. "What war are you running from?" she asked plainly. The leader glanced at the others, then back at her. "Not war. Here. War. There." He lifted a hand, pointing toward the ceiling, his fingers shaking slightly as though the very gesture carried weight. Clara followed his motion and then back to his eyes. "You're saying you're not from Earth?" The man didn't answer right away. His silence was heavier than words. Then finally he said softly, "Yes." The room felt colder for a moment. Clara let the words hang, steadying herself. She'd seen plenty in her life, birth, death, war, and the quiet after. But this? Strangers claiming to be from the stars? It sounded like something from her granddaughter's comic books. Yet she couldn't deny the things she'd seen: the glowing wound, the strange gear, the language that rolled like stone over metal. "Why here?" she asked. "Why Wyoming of all places?" The man's lips thinned. "Storm, safe." Hyde, one of the younger soldiers, stirred and spoke quickly in their tongue. The words clipped, urgent. The leader raised a hand to silence him, then turned back to Clara. "We fight enemy. Lose. Ship fall. We walk?" Clara leaned forward. "Walked through that blizzard?" "From where?" The leader's eyes flickered. "North, miles. Hard." She studied him. His face didn't waver, but there was truth in his exhaustion. These men had been pushed beyond their limits. Still, her mind swirled with images. Crashed ships hidden beneath snow, battles fought in skies she had never seen. Clara's voice softened. "You're far from home, then." The leader's gaze dropped briefly to the floor. "Home. Gone." The words settled heavy between them. The younger soldier, the one who had stroked Smudge's fur earlier, spoke again. His English was more fractured, but his tone carried something raw. "She... right. Not from here. We... lost." Clara glanced at him. His eyes glistened faintly in the firelight, and for a moment he didn't look like a soldier at all, just a boy who'd been torn too far from the place he belonged. "You remind me of my Walter," Clara said quietly, her voice steady though her chest ached. "He came home from Korea with eyes like yours. Tired. Carrying more than one man should." The leader tilted his head. "Walter, your mate?" "My husband," she corrected softly. "He's gone now. Been gone a long time." The man nodded once, slow, deliberate. It was the first gesture that felt almost human. For a while, silence filled the space between them. The fire crackled, wind whistled faintly outside, and the others shifted restlessly in their quilts. Clara studied their boots again, the strange symbols carved into the leather, the faint metallic glimmer beneath their coats. These weren't things made in any factory she knew. She leaned back, fingers tapping against the armrest. "If what you're saying is true, tomorrow is going to be louder than you think. This town may be small, but people notice when something strange shows up in their fields." The leader's eyes narrowed. "No town. No eyes." Quiet Clara gave a dry laugh. "You don't know small-town Wyoming. Folks may keep to themselves, but they see everything." He tilted his head, trying to catch her meaning. "We leave soon." Clara frowned. "How soon?" The leader hesitated, then looked to the others. The boy with Smudge met his gaze and shook his head quickly as if urging caution. The leader said only, "Dawn." Clara felt her chest tighten. Dawn was only hours away. But as the storm eased and the horizon began to pale, Clara realized dawn wouldn't just bring answers. It would bring something far larger, standing in her very own pasture. By the time dawn finally pressed through the cracks in the storm, Clara Winslow's house was hushed. The fire had burned low, leaving the soldiers wrapped in quilts, their shoulders rising and falling in shallow sleep. Clara stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her breath fogging the glass. Outside, the snow stretched across the fields like a pale ocean, its surface broken only by drifts and the bent skeletons of barbed wire fences. The storm had pulled back, but the silence it left behind was unnerving. Snowstorms usually left the land muffled, softened, but this morning felt different, charged, almost waiting. She set the cup down and turned. The leader stirred, his dark eyes opening with sharp awareness, like a man who never truly slept. He rose slowly, his tall frame unfolding as if every muscle had been trained for vigilance. "Morning," Clara said softly. He studied her, then moved to the window. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the field. The other men began waking, stretching stiff limbs, murmuring in their language. Smudge darted away from the sudden motion, her tail flicking as she disappeared beneath the table. Clara stepped closer. "What exactly are you looking for?" The leader didn't answer at first. Then with one slow gesture, He lifted his hand and pointed toward the pasture. Clara followed his gaze. At first, her tired eyes didn't see it. The snow was bright, blinding under the pale sun. But then her breath caught. Something enormous sat in the middle of her field, half buried in snow. It gleamed faintly, as though the light refused to cling to its surface. Angled panels, smooth curves of metal, unlike any machine she had ever seen, jutted through the drifts. At its center, a dark slit pulsed faintly, opening and closing like a mechanical wound. Clara's knees weakened and she gripped the counter to steady herself. Good Lord. The leader turned to her, his face unreadable. Ship. Clara shook her head slowly, her voice barely more than a whisper. You weren't lying. The men moved quickly now, discarding quilts and pulling on their strange coats. Their language filled the room in hurried bursts, sharp syllables ricocheting off the walls. They were alive again, charged with purpose. Clara forced herself toward the door. She slipped on her boots and coat, her hands fumbling with the buttons. When she pushed the door open, the cold cut her like a knife, but she hardly noticed. The soldiers followed, their boots crunching against the snow, leaving deep impressions in the powder. Together they trudged toward the field, the air sharp with frost, the horizon painted in pale blue and orange. The ship loomed larger with each step. It wasn't crashed so much as planted, its frame resting awkwardly in the snow, as if it had landed hard and stopped just shy of breaking apart. Up close, Clara could see markings etched into the metal, symbols she didn't recognize, glowing faintly like embers buried under ash. Her throat felt tight. How is this possible? The younger soldier, the one who had bonded with Smudge, walked beside her, his breath puffed in heavy clouds. Not for you. Not ready. But we. No choice. Clara's boots sank deep into the snow. No choice for what? He looked at her, his expression torn between exhaustion and something almost reverent. To come. The leader reached the base of the ship first. He pressed a hand against the smooth metal, and the slit widened with a low, vibrating sound, spilling pale light onto the snow. The soldiers moved instinctively, stepping inside as though pulled by gravity. Clara stopped just short of the threshold, the brightness washing over her face. Inside, she glimpsed strange panels, wires that pulsed like veins, seats shaped for bodies but not quite human. The air itself smelled different, metallic, sharp, alive. Her heart pounded. This is real. The leader turned back to her, his face, always so stoic, softened. You help. You see, you chosen? Clara's voice cracked. I'm a 74-year-old widow living in a drafty farmhouse. I didn't choose anything. The leader studied her in silence before saying, kindness. Choose you. Clara swallowed hard. Her mind told her to turn back, to shut her door, to pretend none of this had happened. But her feet refused to move. She felt small before the ship, smaller than she had ever felt, but also strangely tethered to these men and their strange burden. Behind them, the snow-covered plains stretched endlessly. There was no one else for miles, no eyes to see what was happening in her field. Only Clara, 10 weary soldiers, and a ship that had no place on Earth. But Clara didn't know the ship carried more than just weary men. It carried truths and warnings that would soon test the limits of her compassion and the strength of her resolve. Clara Winslow stood in the snow as if her boots had frozen to the earth. The ship glowed faintly before her, its edges too smooth, too perfect to have been built by human hands. The soldiers moved inside one after another, their shoulders squared, though exhaustion still clung to them like chains. Clara couldn't stop staring at the markings etched along the side of the vessel. They pulsed gently, in rhythm with something deep inside the craft. It reminded her of a heartbeat, steady, living, impossible. The leader turned back. Come. Clara shook her head. I'm not stepping into that thing. Her voice cracked in the cold morning air. I opened my door to give you warmth, not to walk into whatever this is. The younger soldier, the one who had been gentle with Smudge, approached her slowly. He pulled back his hood, letting the morning light fall across his face. His features looked human, but not quite. His skin held a faint shimmer, subtle, as though catching a light invisible to her eyes. His eyes, darker than coal, seemed endless. "We trust," he said carefully. "We need you." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to turn back to her farmhouse, to retreat into the safety of walls she understood. But there was something in his voice, an echo of the same exhaustion she had seen in Walter's eyes after the war. It was the sound of someone who had carried too much for too long. She stepped forward, not into the ship, not yet, but closer. "Then tell me the truth. All of it. No more broken words, no more riddles. Who are you?" The leader regarded her for a long moment. His jaw flexed as though weighing the risk. Then he motioned to the others. One of them pressed a hand against a panel inside the ship, and a faint hum, low, steady, filled the air. A projection sparked to life above the open doorway. Clara gasped. It was a starfield, vast and unfamiliar, filled with constellations she didn't recognize. Lines traced between them, marking paths, routes, battles. Red streaks cut across the projection like scars, converging on a single world that glowed pale blue, strikingly similar to Earth. The leader pointed. Home. Lost. His voice carried no poetry, no attempt at persuasion, just the raw truth. Clara's chest tightened. "What happened?" He looked at her directly. "War. Enemy strong. Destroy. We run." The younger soldier's voice cracked as he added, "No more family. No more city. Just fight." His accent fractured each word, but Clara understood. Her throat burned. She thought of her own family, her grandchildren safe in Cheyenne, the photographs on her mantle. To lose all of that, to have it burned from the sky, was unthinkable. Another soldier stepped forward, pulling at his sleeve. He revealed an arm scarred not only by wounds, but by something stranger. The skin shimmered faintly, streaked with patterns that looked almost metallic. Clara reached out before she could stop herself. Her fingers hovered just above the surface. "What are you?" she whispered. The man's lips parted, and though his English failed him, his answer was clear. "Soldier. Same as yours?" Clara's hand trembled. They weren't so different. Flesh, blood, fear, pain, and yet everything about them screamed otherworldly. The leader cut through the silence. "We hide here, rest, leave soon. But you need know what?" Clara asked. His gaze shifted back to the projection. Another planet lit up, a glowing blue sphere she recognized instantly. Earth. Her chest went hollow. "Enemy come," he said. "Here." Soon Clara staggered back a step, her boots sinking into the snow. No, that's not possible. This is Earth. We're safe here." The leader's eyes hardened. No safe. Never safe. "You kind not ready?" Her breath quickened. She looked back at the farmhouse, smoke curling gently from the chimney. The ordinary world she had clung to only hours before seemed fragile now, like glass held too tightly in her hands. The younger soldier's voice softened. "You help us. You show kindness." That matter. Clara pressed a hand to her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't sought out answers from the sky. All she had done was open her door to strangers on a freezing night. And yet somehow that simple act had bound her to truths too heavy for her shoulders. The leader stepped closer, his expression sharp. "You tell no one. Or danger come faster." Clara stared at him. "Do you think anyone would believe me if I tried?" For the first time, the man almost smiled. "No." She let out a shaky laugh, half born of fear, half from the absurdity of it all. No, they wouldn't believe her. Not her neighbors, not the sheriff, not her own family. To them, she was just an old widow rattling around in a farmhouse too big for her. She exhaled slowly, snow crystals stinging her lungs. "So what now?" The leader's answer was blunt. "We fix ship. We go, but enemy follow. You remember. Clara shivered, and not from the cold. Remember. The word landed heavy, like a burden she had never asked for. But she knew deep down this wasn't the end of their story together, because when warnings arrive on your doorstep, they have a way of becoming promises. The rest of the morning stretched on in a blur of snow and silence. Clara Winslow lingered on her porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders as the soldiers moved back and forth between the farmhouse and the ship. They carried strange containers, cables, and tools that looked like a marriage of metal and bone, their surfaces alive with faint, shifting light. Each time she thought she could name one piece, something like a wrench or a canteen, the shape seemed to change in her mind, refusing to settle into anything familiar. Her farm had never seen such movement. For years, the only traffic had been delivery trucks, the occasional neighbor stopping by, or the distant rumble of a tractor. Now her snowy field looked like the staging ground of something far bigger than she could comprehend. Clara watched, unease swirling with fascination. They weren't careless. Every step, every motion was precise, almost rehearsed. Even after a night of exhaustion, their discipline returned like muscle memory. And yet she caught glimpses of vulnerability, the broad man clutching his bandaged arm, the younger one pausing to catch his breath as though gravity weighed heavier on him than it should. Finally, the leader returned to the porch. He regarded her for a long moment, then gestured for her to follow. "You see," he said simply. Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking to the ship. The slit in its side still gaped open, glowing faintly. The air around it carried a hum so deep it rattled through her chest. She swallowed hard and nodded. She trudged across the snow beside him, each step crunching in rhythm with her quickened heartbeat. As they neared the craft, the glow brightened, spilling over her boots and painting her breath in pale light. When she stepped inside, the air changed instantly. Warmer, thinner, carrying a metallic tang that coated her tongue. The walls curved in smooth arcs, alive with faint patterns that shifted like ripples in water. Strange panels lit up as the soldiers passed, responding not to touch, but to presence itself. Clara's hand brushed the wall. It was cool, yet it seemed to pulse beneath her palm as if the ship had veins and blood of its own. She jerked back instinctively. The younger soldier noticed. "Ship alive," he said softly. "Alive?" Clara's voice cracked. He nodded once. "Not machine only. Bond. He paused, searching for the word. Symbiosis. Clara's skin prickled. Machines she understood. Machines alive, breathing in some strange way. That was harder. They guided her deeper inside. Seats curved like shells, designed not for human spines but for bodies longer, leaner, with joints placed just differently enough to unsettle her. Symbols floated above the control panels, rearranging themselves without sound. Clara stared, unable to comprehend, yet knowing she was looking at knowledge that would take lifetimes for her kind to understand. At the center of the ship, a hollow column pulsed with light. The soldiers gathered around it, their voices low, words fast in their language. The leader touched the column and the projection flared again. Stars spilling across the air, worlds burning red, lines of battle cutting like scars. Clara staggered back. "Why show me this?" The leader turned. "Because you forget." "We cannot," she frowned. "Forget what?" He moved closer, his dark eyes locked on hers. "That kindness, rare. You help enemy. No weapon, only fire, food, quilt. You change path." Clara's throat tightened. She looked around at the soldiers, at the way their eyes softened in her presence. For all their discipline, all their strangeness, they seemed anchored by the simple act of her opening a door in the middle of a storm. "I only did what anyone decent would have done," she said quietly. The younger soldier shook his head firmly. "No, many closed door. You open." The words pierced deeper than she expected. She had spent years in quiet isolation, her days marked by chores and silence, her nights by memories of Walter. She had thought herself small, unseen, and yet here she was, being told that a single act had altered something far beyond her reach. She stepped closer to the glowing column. "And what does this mean for me? For my people?" The leader's face hardened again. "Enemy not stop. Not after us, not after you." Clara's breath caught. "You mean they'll come here?" The leader gave a single, solemn nod, her chest tightened. She turned back toward the doorway, looking out at her snow-covered pasture. The farmhouse stood small against the horizon, smoke curling from its chimney. Her safe, simple world had been pierced open. "Why tell me?" she asked. "Why not warn the whole world?" The leader's answer was sharp. "World not believe. You believe." The words settled like a stone in her stomach. Believe. Yes, she believed, because she had seen, because she had touched, because she could not deny the glow of the ship beneath her fingertips. But belief was a burden heavier than she had ever wanted to carry. She exhaled slowly, her breath shaking. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The leader's gaze didn't waver. "Remember, when time come, speak." Clara closed her eyes briefly, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. She had opened her door in a storm, thinking only of warmth and stew, and now she stood inside a living ship, carrying warnings for a planet unprepared. But she didn't yet know the soldiers carried something darker than warnings, something that would force her to confront the limits of trust and the meaning of kindness itself. Clara Winslow stepped back out into the cold air, her boots crunching on the crust of snow. For a moment, she was grateful for the sting of the wind on her cheeks. It grounded her. The farmhouse stood across the field, small and steady against the pale horizon, and she clung to that sight as if it might remind her she was still in Wyoming, not some dream stitched from stars and storms. The soldiers followed, their shadows long against the snow. They no longer looked like lost men. They moved with purpose, renewed strength, carried in every stride. The leader stopped at the porch, waiting until Clara had joined him. "You must know," he said. His voice was firmer now, less broken, as though he had practiced every word before speaking them. "Enemy track us. Enemy follow light. They saw hunger." Clara's breath clouded in the air. "Hunger for what?" The younger soldier stepped forward. His dark eyes caught the weak sunlight, glimmering faintly. "For worlds. For yours." The words landed like a stone in Clara's chest. She gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. "You're saying they'll come here? To Earth?" The leader gave a single, deliberate nod. "Not if." When Clara stared at him, the wood rough beneath her palm. "And you brought them?" The air tightened. Several of the soldiers shifted uneasily, their language spilling in quick bursts until the leader silenced them with a sharp command. He turned back to Clara, his expression grim. "We run. We fight, but enemy not stop. They find us, they find you." Her heart thudded against her ribs. "Why tell me this? What can one old woman in Wyoming possibly do?" The younger soldier's voice softened. "Because you listen. You believe. You carry truth." Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Truth? If I tell anyone about this, they'll call me crazy. My own family will shake their heads and talk about how the winters have gotten too long for me." The leader's eyes didn't flinch. "Then wait. When sky burned, they believe." The wind swept across the field, lifting fine crystals of snow into the air. Clara shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. The sky burning, that wasn't just a warning, that was a vision. She looked at the men. Their faces bore scars, fatigue, but also something deeper. Resignation. They weren't warning her because they thought Earth could stop it. They were warning her because they had seen what came next. And it was horror. Clara's voice trembled. "If what you're saying is true, then there's nothing I can do." "Nothing anyone can do." The younger soldier shook his head. "Not nothing. Kindness change fight, kindness ripple." She stared at him, the words strange yet cutting. Kindness. The very thing she had thought so small, opening her door on a stormy night, was now being held up as something larger. The leader stepped closer. His breath hung between them in the cold air. When time come, remember this. Enemy, not fear weapon. Enemy, fear bond. Unity. That is weapon stronger. Clara's eyes stung, though she blamed the wind. She thought of Walter, of how he had once told her in hushed tones that men didn't survive war by bullets alone, but by the brother beside them, by the hand that pulled them out of the mud. Maybe these strangers weren't so different. She whispered, "You've lost everything, haven't you?" The leader's face barely moved, but his eyes betrayed him. Yes, and if your world not ready, you lose too. For a long moment, the only sound was the whistle of wind against the farmhouse siding. Clara looked back at her porch, at the door she had opened in the middle of the night. It seemed so ordinary now, but it had become a threshold between two worlds, one of soup and quilts, the other of ships and stars. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. "So you're asking me to carry this warning. Alone." "Not alone," the younger soldier said quickly. He placed a hand against his chest, his voice breaking. "We carry too. But you..." Our witness, Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't been anyone's witness in years. She had faded into the quiet of age, of loss, of days that slipped by unremarkable. Now, in the space of one night, she had been handed a burden too heavy for even a country to bear. She met the leader's gaze. "What happens if your enemies arrive sooner than you expect?" The man's answer was blunt, sharp as the air itself. "Then all worlds burn." The words echoed in her ears louder than the storm had been. All worlds burn. Clara's grip on the railing tightened until her knuckles ached. But as heavy as those words were, Clara didn't yet realize the soldiers weren't finished with her. They had one last request, one that would test the very core of who she was. By midday, the snow had settled into a quiet blanket across the plains. The storm had passed, leaving a silence so sharp it made every sound stand out. The crunch of boots, the creak of wood, even the faint hiss of the stove still burning inside Clara Winslow's farmhouse. Clara stood on her porch, her shawl tight across her shoulders, watching as the soldiers prepared to leave. They moved with a kind of tired urgency. Some carried strange cases that seemed too light for their size. Others adjusted metallic straps across their chests. Every motion told her they had done this before, many times, in places far from here. Yet there was something different in the air now. Less frantic, more final. The younger soldier approached her first. He carried one of her quilts draped over his arm. The edges were damp, frayed from use, but folded neatly. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "You give," he said softly. "We return." Clara took it slowly. The fabric was still warm from his shoulders. "Keep it," she said, pushing it back into his hands. "You'll need it more than I will." He looked at her, his eyes wide, and after a moment, he pressed the quilt back against his chest, clutching it as though it carried more weight than any weapon he owned. The leader joined them, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the snow. He studied Clara, his face unreadable, before finally speaking. "We go. You stay?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to ask them to stay longer, to rest, to give her more time to make sense of what she had seen. But she knew this wasn't her choice. They had their path, and she had hers. She asked the only question that mattered. "Will I ever see you again?" The leader's silence stretched, then he shook his head once. "Not likely. But you?" Remember, Clara's chest ached. She wanted to argue, to insist that memory wasn't enough, that warnings shouldn't be carried by one old woman in a farmhouse no one cared to visit. But the look in his eyes told her that memory was all they could give her. The younger soldier stepped closer, lowering his voice. "When sky change, you tell them. Tell all." Her hands trembled around the railing. "And if they don't believe me, then wait," he said. "Truth always come." The men began moving toward the ship. Clara followed, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The vessel loomed before them, its surface catching the pale sun. The slit widened as they approached, spilling light that turned the snow around it into glassy crystals. One by one, the soldiers entered, their dark silhouettes swallowed by the glow. The younger soldier lingered at the threshold, looking back at Clara. For a moment, she thought he might step toward her again, might say something more. But instead, he raised one hand in a gesture that was both farewell and gratitude. Clara raised her hand, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulders. The gesture felt small against the weight of what was happening, but it was all she had. The leader was the last to enter. He paused at the doorway, his gaze steady on her. "You show us mercy. That change war. Remember." Then he stepped inside and the slit sealed shut. Clara stood alone in the snow, the silence pressing in from all sides. For a long moment, nothing happened. She wondered if the ship would remain there, a frozen monument in her pasture. But then the ground vibrated beneath her boots, a low tremor rolling through the field. The vessel lifted slowly, snow cascading off its sides in great sheets. The air roared, and Clara stumbled back, clutching her shawl against her chest. The ship rose higher, its glow brightening until she had to shield her eyes. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it shot upward, vanishing into the pale sky. The field was empty. Only deep impressions in the snow remained, marking where the soldiers had stood, where the ship had rested. Clara's farmhouse looked the same as it always had, smoke drifting lazily from the chimney, the porch sagging under years of weather. But nothing was the same. Her hand fell to the quilt still folded over her arm, the one she had tried to give back. Its fabric was damp, heavy, real. Proof that it had all happened. Proof that kindness could stretch far beyond what she had ever imagined. Clara turned toward her house. Each step back across the snow felt heavier than the last. She knew that no matter how quietly life resumed, no matter how ordinary tomorrow might look, she would never see the world the same way again. But Clara didn't yet realize the hardest part wasn't their departure. It was carrying the weight of their warning alone in a world that wasn't ready to hear it. The field looked almost untouched by the time Clara Winslow stepped back onto her porch. The snow had drifted across most of the imprints, softening the scars left behind by boots and landing gear. Only she would remember where the soldiers had stood, where the ship had pressed down into the earth. To anyone else, it was just another Wyoming winter morning. Frost biting at the window, smoke curling from chimneys, and silence stretching for miles. Clara lowered herself into the rocking chair by the door, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. She pressed Walter's quilt tight against her lap, staring out at the white expanse. Her hands shook, though whether from the cold or from everything she had just seen, she couldn't tell. She wanted to believe it had been a dream, that 10 strange men had not walked through her door in the middle of a blizzard, that she had not stepped inside a living ship, that no warning about Earth's sky burning had been spoken in the cold. But the quilt in her lap was still warm from the hands of a soldier who had clutched it like a lifeline. Dreams didn't leave behind proof. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and stew, the same as it had every winter since Walter's passing. Smudge leapt into her lap, curling into a ball atop the quilt, her purr steady, grounding. Clara stroked the cat's fur, her eyes unfocused. Her mind spun with questions. Should she call her daughter in Cheyenne? Should she tell Pastor Long at the little church down the road? Would the sheriff laugh if she tried to explain? She pictured the faces of each of them, imagined their polite nods and sideways glances, the quiet conversations after she left. Poor Clara, the winters finally caught up with her. She clenched her jaw. They wouldn't believe her, not until something changed in the sky. Her thoughts drifted back to the younger soldier's words. Truth always comes. It wasn't comfort, not really, but it was something. She had lived long enough to know that time had a way of revealing what people didn't want to see. Clara rose slowly and moved inside. She set the quilt on the table, smoothing its frayed edges, as though anchoring herself to the ordinary. She lit another lamp, stoked the stove, and set a fresh pot of coffee to boil. The motions were familiar, steady, the rhythm of a life she had built in this house. But behind every action lurked the memory of the ship, the glow of its walls, the sharp certainty in the leader's eyes when he had spoken of enemies who would not stop. By evening, the snow outside gleamed under a pale moon. Clara stood at the window, mug in hand, watching the horizon. She wondered if the soldiers were already light years away, or if they lingered just beyond her sight, repairing, preparing, always watching the sky. Her heart ached with something she hadn't felt in years, a mixture of fear and responsibility. She had no weapons, no army, no power. But she had a truth she couldn't bury, and maybe when the time came, that truth would matter. She whispered into the quiet room, her voice trembling but clear. "Walter, if you were here, you'd tell me to keep faith. That people will need to hear this when the time comes." "I hope you're right." The house gave no answer, only the steady creak of its beams and the soft purr of smudge by the fire. Clara set down her mug and moved to the porch once more. She looked up at the sky, stars scattered sharp against the black. For the first time in years, she felt small not because of her age or her loneliness, but because she had seen just how vast the universe truly was. And yet, in that vastness, her kindness had mattered. 10 soldiers carried her warmth with them into the dark. She drew a long breath and let it out, her voice steady. "If they come, I'll remember. I'll speak." The wind carried her words into the night, across the snow, into the silence of the plains. And though she couldn't see it, though she might never see it, far beyond her little farmhouse, there were men who remembered her too. Men who knew that in the middle of a frozen storm on a small blue planet, a woman had opened her door and changed their path. Because sometimes the smallest act, an open door, a bowl of stew, a quilt stitched years ago, can echo louder than any weapon, carrying hope across galaxies. Clara Winslow's story is a reminder: kindness is never wasted. It may not stop the storms, it may not end the wars, but it can change lives, and sometimes it can change the fate of worlds. If you believe that too, subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters.